Hello, and welcome to the Glasshouse webcast. Today's topic, how to build an IaaS cloud, will be presented by Dick Benton, Glasshouse Principal Consultant. Dick brings many years' experience in the role of technology governance, cloud computing, and disaster recovery consulting. Dick has written extensively on these subjects in industry magazines and has helped numerous clients develop business-aligned strategies. Ladies and gentlemen, Dick Benton.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our friends on the other side of the world. So the subject of today's discussion is how can you in fact build your own internal infrastructure as a service cloud? Can you transition your existing environment to that cloud model? And at first blush, this may seem like a Herculean task. But in reality, it's really a matter of following a few simple rules and adopting a few disciplines and finding some good tools. Now, let's put some caveats in here, of course. We're going to shortly look at a terminology and some definitions, and then we're going to walk through some cloud benefits and drivers, look at what cloud to build, who are the cloud consumers, and then walk through a 7-step plan to how you might implement your own infrastructure as a service cloud. So let's start with terminology. Now, today, just about every vendor and every group is defining cloud often in terms of their own product. We in the services side of things see cloud really as an IT services deployment model. And it's a model that essentially focuses on self-service to the end consumer to provide immediate satisfaction. It offers guaranteed service level attributes, and in the public cloud, at this point, some of those service level attributes are perhaps less than what we might have in an internal enterprise operation. The cloud also, by definition, should offer unlimited scalability, both up and down. And that aspect may be a little more difficult to achieve internally, where you don't have the ability to spread your infrastructure over such a large and wide audience. However, it should be doable, particularly in the larger enterprise that has multiple campuses and multiple operations. Cloud definition also includes a critical feature, billing for actual services and resources consumed. And we'll discuss this in a little more detail further on in the presentation, but that is often one of the major stumbling blocks for the CIO trying to implement an internal cloud service. Many organizations either do not want the complexity of billing at that level or feel that it's not culturally sustainable. But without at least the visibility of costs based on resource usage, the whole model kind of founders a little. Typically, cloud is supported by high levels of automation and highly virtualized infrastructure, just as a basis to deliver the various attributes that we've discussed. So let's pause briefly and talk about some views I've heard on internal cloud. I was at a presentation or a big seminar in New York recently, and on several occasions I heard the term internal cloud as an oxymoron. And I guess that view was expressed by people who run external public clouds, and possibly because they felt that the internal cloud couldn't possibly compete with them. But I think we'll see as we go through this that the internal cloud can compete, and in many cases may be a precursor to use of some type of an external cloud. Let's try to get a little further into some of the terminology that we see out there. And I think I think that you've all heard these terms: commodity cloud, enterprise cloud, public cloud, private cloud, external cloud, internal cloud, and they all really mean different things to different people. So in what I've done here in this little matrix is show the key characteristics of each of these types of cloud and what their common usage is and what they might also be called. So a commodity cloud can also be most likely a public cloud and typically is provided externally. If we look at the enterprise cloud, typically we're expecting resiliency by infrastructure, whereas in the commodity cloud or the external cloud, we're looking at resiliency by application. And this is a pretty key differentiation, particularly as the internal cloud will be primarily focused on resiliency through infrastructure. As is done today in your operation, you construct your architecture to provide various levels of RPO, RTO, and you do various implementations of clustering to provide resiliency. In the commodity cloud, resiliency is expected to be provided by the application being able to be fault tolerant and handle failure, but also the disaster recovery component is a purchasable service. And those of you who watched the Amazon event recently with some amazement, those people who suffered the most were those who had not purchased disaster recovery. And organizations like Netflix that built in resiliency to their application and had purchased DR did not experience that level of failure. So I think, in moving into the cloud, it's important to say, okay, we're looking at an enterprise cloud, internal cloud, and that's most likely going to be an enterprise level cloud, and it's going to be considered private by the simple fact that no one else is going to access that cloud. So why is there all this pressure on IT to go cloud? And I think, without being too cynical, I think in many organizations IT is under siege. They have such a backload, such a workload that really they're nearly always having to say, I'm sorry, we can't do that, or we don't have the funds for that. And this puts them in significant danger of being bypassed. In fact, there was something in the industry about a month ago where a pharmaceutical scientist stood up and proudly spoke about how his science team had utilized the cloud to achieve wonderful things. And the really sad fact was that his IT group did not even know that his team was using an external service. So what does this mean? It means that in many cases IT is perceived as an impediment or a roadblock to the aggressive and the assertive go-getter in the corporate world. Services provided are not valued or appreciated. What they get today is not always valued until it's missing. And the inability of consumers to articulate their needs specifically ends up in IT having to over-configure or gold plate for a just-in-case situation. Of course, these days, there's always an insufficient budget, and poor old IT is just too busy fighting alligators to drain the swamp. How are we going to build a cloud when we're up to our neck in a backlog of requests and services and new projects? So, in trying to address this really difficult situation, I think there is hope, there is light there at the end of the tunnel, and that it's not a train coming the other way. So the CIO can start a transition and move from always saying no to saying yes, and here's what it will cost. Now, you can't do that unless you know what it is going to cost. And so, perhaps start by selecting an outside cloud services provider and help your consumers use them instead of standing in front of them saying, no, you can't. You need to, of course, provide advice on some of the constraints and drawbacks, and that's an interesting little subject in its own. Is the cloud more secure than your internal operation? And just as I think as a sideline, there's some papers come out by IDC indicating that perhaps the cloud is more secure than the private world, and the private world seems to have a number of beleaguered and underpaid system admins who are expected to do everything and who are constantly under pressure. You kind of wonder what their lifestyle is like compared to those who work at some of the big service cloud providers. I think the second message for the CIO is to aggressively compete where you can. Start a rapid transition to allow your internal resources to be deployed in a similar billable manner, and do it just as easily and just as quickly. Now, that's actually another of this presentation. How are we going to do that? How are we going to get to a service deployment model where the internal IT team can aggressively compete with an external cloud? So if we adopt those guidelines, then there's an impact that confounds the expectations that IT will always be an impediment. Here we are saying, yes, we can help you do this. This is what it will cost. Here's the easy way to get there. These are the things you have to think about. It starts building a service-oriented face of IT rather than those of backroom technical people. And it builds an acknowledgement that IT resources do, in fact, come at a price. And I keep coming back to this issue, but, if IT ran a hamburger shop, they'd be providing all of their hamburgers free to anybody who wanted them. And that's not exactly a model that's guaranteed to be successful, nor is it one that's going to actually provide hamburgers that might, in fact, taste relatively good. So a key takeaway here is that when IT is free, it's really not valued. When cloud is provided by outsourcers, it does build an acknowledgement that IT resources come at a price. And unfortunately, that very basic foundational philosophy is missing in most IT departments today. And most of the organizations that I and my team work with have little idea of their per-unit deployable resource costs. Now, they certainly do know their budget, they know what they're spending, they know how much their major equipment costs, but they can't tell you the cost, the dollar per gigabyte of deployable storage, or the dollar per gigahertz of deployable compute resources. So I think the final takeaway here is that the prudent CIO will look to compete with cloud providers on quality of service attributes. Now, given that a high percentage of the application environment is highly likely to be fairly clumsy legacy type applications, those are often the least suitable for use in the external cloud, although I've seen software starting to emerge that claims to be able to port these with some ease to the external cloud. But, when you look at things like the tied RPO and RTO for both operational and disaster recovery that many internal enterprise environments support, and you look at the security requirements and the compliance requirements and encryption requirements, we often find that there are going to be significant areas where the user community will prefer to have the in-house quality of service attributes rather than those provided by the cloud. Now, I'm not saying they cannot use the cloud and that it's right to use the internal environment. But I think the reality is that there are many, many organizations today who are just a little tentative to put the crown jewels out there in a public space that's advertised as being shared tenancy. So there are some real opportunities here for the CIO to start building the sort of environment that changes perceptions of IT. Benefits for the consumer are dramatic improvements in time to market, and effectively that's basically when somebody asks for a resource, they ask for it in an interactive discussion that results in the provisioning of that service or resource directly to them. So no longer do they fill in a form and then wait 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months for IT to respond. Automating the back-end billing brings a new cost-conscious awareness. And, you know, when an end user has a choice of choosing a service at 2 or 3 different service levels, each with dramatically different costs, there tends to be an awareness that is not there when it's all free. Now, the ability to use OpEx for short-term needs instead of CapEx has been one of the key benefits talked about in the movement to the cloud. And OpEx is over CapEx, of course, is only of value if it can be, in fact, turned off. So de facto, that means it's for a short-term need. Now, how do we provide that as in an internal environment? I think that to a certain extent, the model of deploying the services internally can provide them under an OpEx model. The funding from that OpEx is going to have to buy capital, and the short-term needs need to be sufficiently predictable that approach doesn't come apart. Probably a more realistic approach here is in phase 1 to look at having OpEx for short-term needs met by some form of cloud bursting capability, so that when your resources internally are incapable of meeting a sudden burst of requirement, perhaps by some data analytics process, then you have the ability to help the consumer move to an external cloud and pick that up. The benefits of taking the internal cloud approach and melding it, excuse me, with perhaps an external cloud through cloud bursting is that all of a sudden IT becomes recognized as a competitive service supplier instead of the forced choice. So now IT can say yes, and here's what it would cost. High levels of automation are going to provide savings within IT. So, you know, the complexities of provisioning can bring tears to the eyes. If that process can be automated, there are tremendous internal savings from the administration overhead that are reduced. Consolidation and rationalization of the infrastructure will also produce savings, and cloud gives us a great rationale to start down that track. So, you know, do we want 5, 6, 7 service storage platforms? Do we want 5 or 6 compute platforms? Or do we want 1 or 2? And when we look at how each technology effectively requires its own administrative process, there are significant savings there by looking at some consolidation or rationalization. Again, the turn-on, turn-off OpEx provides savings, but typically more to the consumer than within the internal IT group. So, who are the internal IT cloud consumers? And, you know, there's the old joke, we have met the enemy and he is us, and in fact the internal IT consumers tend to be mostly developers and application teams and database teams. And I'm sure those of you who've been around a while know that happiness for a DBA is all the storage they can get, and that an application team and a developer can never have too many versions of their development and test data. And they kind of always want it today or tomorrow, and certainly not 3 weeks out. Now, these groups in the IT supply chain are totally dependent on infrastructure service supply to provide them with what they need to do their job. And sadly, these are also the people who are astute enough and competent enough to actually seek those services outside if they get frustrated with the internal IT environment. So, you know, in many cases, we can be white-handed from within, and because our own internal people are dissatisfied with our own internal services. Corporate cloud consumers are often the more technologically literate business units. They tend to do analytics and decision support. They need to take huge amounts of storage and use them for short-term periods, or huge amounts of compute power to do some analytical work. And the Microsoft Office consumer is also today effectively enjoying storage on demand. And we've all seen the result of that in an unbridled growth of Microsoft Office type files with no ability to control that because nobody's actually paying for it, which takes us back to our original point that when it's free, it's usually used without conscience. So the key takeaway here is that to service the consumer, you really have to have a highly mature supply and demand model. You really have to know over time what is happening. What is the growth rate? What is the differential between the periods in your growth rate? Is there a trend? Is it totally random? What are the peaks? Where are they occurring? Typically, it's highly likely that you will need some form of technology that permits over-provisioning. Not always. If you have a reasonable, sane supply and demand trending, you may not, but very few people have reasonable and sane supply and demand models these days, with the various user communities feeling their oats and getting ever more innovative with what technology can do for them. And finally, as I mentioned before, having within your internal cloud approach the ability to burst out of that to handle peaks should be a major component of the planning process. Let's talk about the journey to the cloud. How do we get from a situation where we're up to our lower back in the swamp fighting alligators and we're supposed to be draining the swamp? And the foundation has been around for a long time. It's called the service provider model. And the service provider model, I think, became a little more public with the adoption of ITIL, the IT Infrastructure Library set of standards. But the service provider model has been around for about 10 years. And the service provider model very simply says that IT should provide services in a catalog, just like LLD. Here is what we have to sell. This is what it costs. This is the guarantee associated with it, and we will get it to you within 1 or 2 days, or you can have express shipment. Very, very similar model. And the rationale is that it gets us away from managing 5,000 servers and 5,000 applications to managing perhaps 5 or 6 tiers of service, or 7 or 8 or 9 service offerings in the cloud environment. Managing 5 to a dozen entities is extremely doable, but even the most dedicated IT team runs into challenges trying to manage 5,000 individual applications and a backup for each application, and disaster recovery for each application, and an expansion and a development for each of those applications. So let's talk about what is the service provider model. It consists of, first of service level agreements that tell the person purchasing the service exactly what it is they're going to get in terms they can understand. That is, performance, scalability, recoverability, etc. The services are defined in a catalog, which, as I mentioned before, is just like the LL Bean catalog. Behind all this, we need very mature policy and procedure, and those policies and procedures really need to be automated in their implementation. And then finally, and critically, a cost model with key performance metrics being implemented is absolutely essential. So the service catalog says, here is what we have to offer our community, our consumers. The service level agreement is the contract under which those services are provided. The policies and the procedures need to be highly efficient to make this work, and in the cloud environment, it's almost mandatory that they be automated. It's hard to imagine how it could be done without that. And then finally, the cost model identifying the cost of the actual deliverable, and the key performance indicators around who's using what are mission critical. So what are the 7 steps that are needed to build your own infrastructure as a service cloud? And surprisingly, it's build a service catalog, create a service level agreement, build your KPIs, make sure you have an inventory of all of your infrastructure, and this is usually a significant challenge to most organizations. Implement billing per consumable resource, and again, another significant challenge to most organizations, typically an organizational culture challenge. Rationalize the infrastructure, and this requires significant courage on the part of the CIO to move away from the plethora of purpose-specific technologies and try to get that down to 1 or 2. And then automate the provisioning and deprovisioning. And fortunately, while that's one of the most difficult pieces to do in-house, there's an increasing number of tools out there and software developments out there that are providing that function. So let's walk through these 7 steps and see what's involved. I'm going to speed up a little because let's see, we're about halfway through. So key points: 3 to 5 service tiers based on consumer-facing attributes. Tier differentiation is based on performance and recoverability. Cost differentials are driven by configured consumable to meet the service attributes. So what is a tier of service or a service offering? So in a storage service, it might simply be 500 gigabyte of high-performance storage. And basically the definition of what the performance is should be in terms of those who are purchasing that service. How it's actually configured behind the scenes should be of less interest to the consumer. The cost difference between a high-performance storage and a medium or a low-performance storage should be significant enough that when those services are chosen, there's some implicit motivation there to choose something that is good for the corporation rather than something that perhaps is good for the ego of the chooser. So once our service catalog is put together, we need to think about performance, scalability, and protection attributes of what consumers care about. They don't, in theory, care about whether it's fiber channel or connections by CNAs or HBAs. Typically, tier cost differentials I would expect to be around 50%. So if your high-performance choice for computing is $50 a gigahertz, I'd expect that the next level down would be $25 a gigahertz, and the level below that would be $12 a gigahertz. And the reason is that if there isn't a significant differentiation in cost, there's little point in separating those services. The choice is not sufficiently definitive to drive behaviors and to have people in your consumer world take a more rational approach to selection. And what we would hope to see as we move down the track with this is that there is a change in corporate citizenship, with resources being selected in not only a cost-conscious manner but in a visible manner, so that the rest of the organisation is aware of who's using what expensive resources and for what purposes. Step 2 is to build a service level agreement, and this is simply the contract that defines how your services are going to be provided. And if you look at any external cloud provider, they too will have a service level agreement, and it might be surprising how little would be in that agreement compared to what you can provide in an internal environment. Now, the written guarantee of what's provided changes the whole IT consumer dynamic. The challenge we have is, what do we do if we don't meet them? What are the penalties? What are the remediation clauses? And that's an interesting little negotiation piece to take internally as you build friends with your CFO organisation to get some guidance on this. But the service level agreement should include, who are the parties, of course, the parties' responsibilities, mutual responsibilities, and most importantly, what do you do and where do you go if things go wrong? If you really don't want to be publishing a service level agreement or a guarantee unless you're pretty confident you can meet your targets. So scope out your competition and compare your service level agreement with theirs, and add value the outside provider may not be capable of, like disaster recovery perhaps, or latency tolerance, etc. Step 3 is to build your key performance indicators. You really need to make sure that you can tell very quickly what is happening right now and who is using what and what is available and what the consumption patterns are and alerts and escalations. And that's easier in some places than others. Who's using what and what's available is a little bit easier to figure out in storage than perhaps in a compute environment where you're looking at memory utilization or CPU utilization. But given that the compute environment is a totally virtualized environment to support the cloud, then these days a lot of those virtualization pieces of software will provide this type of information. So, if you don't know what's happening, you'll always be surprised, and it's unfortunate how many surprises occur in the traditional enterprise IT, just simply because they've not really had the time to build the fire breaks because they're too busy fighting the fires. So monitoring and alerting IT service delivery capability is key, and we also have to make sure that we monitor and alert the supply and demand situation, and that we have thresholds that are going to trigger definitive action and be able to complete that action in the time available. Metrics separate fact from opinion, and I'm sure you've all been involved in a situation where somebody comes fuming into the IT and says, we've got to have better storage because storage is a bottleneck to performance, and of course we usually respond to that by doing exactly what's asked for, rather than investigating the situation where we might find that an ineptly constructed SQL query is the problem and not the storage performance. So, in the absence of metrics, it's really, you wonder why we make such major decisions that have such cost impacts without actually understanding the metrics involved. But the reason is, of course, that there's so much pressure on IT on a day-to-day basis that, reacting and responding is valued above getting it right the first time. So, having your key performance indicators or your metrics puts you at the wheel instead of under it. And trended metrics at the end of the day are the first step to continuous improvement. If you don't know what's happening and how it's trending, it's really difficult to take preemptive action and to improve it. Inventory your infrastructure. So everybody agrees you really need to know what you've got, what's running on it, what it's connected to, what it's dependent on. And many organizations kind of, sort of, partly have this in a number of spreadsheets scattered across the organization. Unfortunately, while XLS is a really handy tool, it is really a poor substitute for a relational database that actually records all of the operational assets of the organization. And I think as ITIL has become more and more popular, we've seen the adoption of the term CMDB, Configuration Management Database, which should identify every server in the organization and the storage it's connected to and the applications that run on it, the business processes that use those applications, the business units themselves, the dependencies and the nature of the dependencies. There's quite a huge amount of information. And you really have to wonder how you could actually affect change and release management without that information. And I guess the short answer is with a great deal of courage and the ability to rapidly respond with seat-of-the-pants repair, which is really not a good way to go. It really just creates more alligators in the swamp. So, without a formal configuration management database, changes will only generate more incidents and outages and cause more challenge. So let's just pause for a moment and see where we're at so far. So service provider model, as we've discussed its components, matures the IT organization. Service catalog is published to consumers. Service level attributes are defined and signed by all parties. Costs of each service is now visible. IT infrastructure is disciplined into tiers or into services. The environment itself is measured and monitored through key performance indicators that are published perhaps monthly. And change management is mature and integrated with a full configuration management database. So the takeaways from this are that the service provider model approach reduces the number of alligators sufficiently to drain the swamp. Really, when we look at what the service provider model does, we have to ask ourselves, how can we possibly operate any other way? And I've heard some folks say, well, that doesn't apply to this application. And indeed, it may not, but you know what? I would rather have 95% of my environment running this way with a 5% exception than have a 95% exception. So these are some of the things to think very carefully about. This is IT foundational, and whether you go cloud or not, this is a good thing to do for the reasons that we've discussed. Step 5 is to implement back-end billing. Now, in the billing environment, visibility is more important than chargeback. So, you often can't get the finance organization to agree to the complexities and the workload of charging for the individual resources, but you have to make them visible, and you have to have a cost model that provides the cost of the deployable unit. And that model needs to include hardware and software and licensing and maintenance, as well as facilities, power and cooling, and administration, which is your IT labor. Now, it's interesting if you trend the changes in these parameters over time and see what's happening. Is hardware and software costs coming down? Well, probably not, but I wonder if it's coming down on a per unit basis, and it probably is. And administration and IT labor, is that going up? And perhaps not if you look on a per unit basis, but I bet it is if you look at it as a gross figure. So there are some very important aspects in figuring out what we're going to do with back-end billing and how we're going to identify and manage the costs associated with it. But at the end of the day, if you've got costs, you've got justification and ROI at your fingertips. You speak with a CFO in the same language, and that's always important because I guess we all know that CFOs just say no unless you can provide them with information in the terms of which they're used to looking at, and those are dollars, not esoteric philosophical concepts. And lastly, but not least importantly, visibility to costs impact resource usage. Everybody will choose gold service levels when they don't have to pay for them. When they do have to pay for them, suddenly silver, bronze, copper, and even dirt begins to look really good. Caveats on billing. So we talked about cultural problems, and but I think, as you make friends with your finance, you need to consider some other interesting aspects. What are you going to recover? Your usage cost, the allocated cost, or a markup to cover inflation and to cover what you'll need to buy next year. So, those are discussions that really need to end up being formulated as corporate policy, and it's really difficult to do that unless you've made friends with finance. So it's key that you find a reasonably high-level manager within finance to help you do this. For those enterprise IT operations that are fortunate enough to have their own finance department, this becomes a little easier, but even they will need to make friends with their partners in the finance group to make sure there's buy-in to these things, right? So rationalizing the infrastructure. This is very, very controversial, and there's a lot of disagreement and debate around this. Typically, today, we find when we go into an enterprise that they have a policy that says we will have 2 or 3 key vendors so that we have options at purchase time. And that's great, but I wonder if they look at the savings they expect from having that choice compared to the cost they're incurring on a daily basis, because each of those technologies requires training and resources to support and manage them. So that's an interesting little side issue. The key points in rationalizing the infrastructure are that not all resources can be automatically provisioned, and big box Unix does require a lot more effort. Today, the obvious target is the virtualized x86 platform, and that's really where infrastructure as a service needs to be focused at this point in time. And I can't stress that enough, that it's only on the x86 platform that you will find the software and the support tools and the firmware and the hardware that is truly cloud-oriented and can achieve the objectives of cloud. Storage has been virtualized since the early Sam NAS days and isn't such a big deal, but we really need to think now about CNC and perhaps the concept of thin provisioning and make sure that is capable. And one final thought here is that when you plug in a new compute capability, one would hope that the environment would automatically recognize it and make it available to the hypervisor for provisioning. So, key takeaway, and no surprise to anybody, is that virtualization is key to automated provisioning. Automated provisioning is, in fact, key to an effective cloud. And don't forget that automated provisioning needs some sort of automated deprovisioning. So, typically what happens with Microsoft Office usage in the traditional world is you get to use whatever files you want, so that's effectively automated provisioning. But there's no process to deprovision. And it's interesting to consider a parameter like time to live when you're provisioning both compute resources and storage. Perhaps a time to live might issue an alert that requires some sort of escalation or secondary level approval to continue. So let's have a look at the key points here. Complexity drives costs. So every time you add a technology, you're adding complexity. And every time you add complexity, you're adding administrative costs. And you're adding procedural costs, because the procedures oftentimes for each of the platforms chosen vary sufficiently that they can't be common. You need a skill set, And because skill sets are carried by people, people carry costs, and it's usual that perhaps, an individual can manage actually only 2 or 3 skill sets at a time. Now, there are those brilliant people that we all value highly who actually understand every technology in the IT environment, but they're, I think, more the exception. To reduce admin costs, we've got to reduce the number of vendors and platforms to a rationalized set of trusted partners, and we've got to automate everything. So we keep coming back to this theme, automate, 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 and the more common the platform environment you have, the easier and more cost-effectively that automation it can be accommodated. So automation is key to your administrative cost savings, and we have to wonder, how come we in IT haven't spent more time on this in the past? But of course the reality is that perhaps the virtualization of the compute platform hasn't been around really that long. And at the end of the day, because we haven't really implemented the service provider model, we've really been way too busy fighting alligators to do anything about draining the swamp. So rationalizing the number of key partners and vendors is essential to reducing complexity and thus costs. And it's a tough decision to make because oftentimes hardware is purchased for reasons other than it being perhaps the most appropriate. But life wasn't meant to be easy. So again, take this as information and try to do the best you can in reducing the number of variables in your environment. At step 7, we come back to automate provisioning just to make sure that we have actually made the point. We've mentioned this, I think, throughout the presentation. But the key cloud visible component, I think, is that consumers want rapid self-provisioning. Now, this is sometimes called time to market, but basically the IT service consumer doesn't want to wait, and they've had a gut full of waiting for 2 days, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months in some cases to get hardware on which to run their stuff. Now, most of these folk are in fact internal IT people, and today you might be really surprised to find that your developers are already using an external cloud unofficially. Now, I don't know how they pay for that. I guess, maybe they've found some innovative way to use credit cards. But, let's not forget this is what it's about. If we cannot provision at least same day, and preferably at the end of the dialogue over the internet with the consumer, then we really haven't got very far towards cloud, and we've still got all the overheads that drive so much cost and efficiency within IT. It should be like buying something from the catalog. And, a typical dialogue might be search the catalog, select the services, get a price, accept the quote by entering your corporate credit card or whatever process there is, and then have immediately availability to that resource, immediate. And then have the ability to go back into that environment and track your usage versus your allocation. So there's only, 6 things there, but each of them are absolutely critical. And when you look at this, you think, my goodness, this should be a bill of rights for the consumer. They should be able to look at a catalog, select their services, get a quote, accept the quote with their credit card, have immediate availability, and track usage. Goodness me. So why can't we do that today? And the answer is the complexity of our environment, the complexity of our processes, the complexity of the current deployment architecture, and these are things that are driving the vision of the cloud as a new way to do things. So key takeaways from automating provisioning. Make a list of the key provisioning features and functions you're going to need. Identify the platforms and APIs that your applications are going to need, and use this to compare vendors in an RFP. Mature organizations can consider self-development, and there's some interesting open source software out there now that can be used to drive some of that. Not something for the smaller organization, but something that could well be There's a number of hardware vendors out there and third parties. There's a tremendous amount of action going on. Every day we see new products, new companies being formed. So there's a rich world out there. Which of these will survive? We don't know, but there's already many of them being purchased by major players. So stay updated, check your web information sources frequently. So in summary, what are the hard parts of having an internal cloud? Front-end provisioning, back-end invoicing, and virtualizing your x86 platform. The easy parts are building the disciplines and services to provide your price service catalog, your service level agreements, and performance indicators. At the end of the day, this is really just good business practice for IT, and we kind of really should have been there already. But of course, the more issues that come up because we don't have this create a workload that prevent us getting there, kind of catch-22, right? And then the outcomes that from managing 5,000 entities to managing 5+ or 10+ tiers of service has a huge impact on everything within IT. A disciplined framework where you know what you've got and you've got the metrics to manage it. And it's really scary when we go into a fairly large enterprise and we find that they do in fact know what they've got, but it's known only by Fred or Mary who are, right down at the bottom of the organization, and there's no formalized corporate memory to track that. So yes, internal infrastructure as a service is doable. Much of the work is simply IT best practice. Rationalizing your hardware environment is the most challenging. Auto provisioning is least mature, but we're seeing some really impressive products beginning to come out. Lifesaver is that the rapid development of all things cloud is just running at an amazing pace. So what are your next steps? Build your service provider model. Classify your applications against the services outlined in that catalog. Plan your migration and plan your back out, and then go for it. So it is doable. And some of the things you have to think about are, I think, can you scale like Amazon? Absolutely not. But then do you really need to? That sort of extreme scaling should be provided, I think, by an external provider. Can you achieve effectively the use of OpEx versus CapEx? Well, only from the consumer point of view, IT is still going to have to do the CapEx piece, but where there is a sufficient drive, again, the external bridge through cloud bursting can take you to an external cloud that will support that. So now it's time for questions and comments, and I've cunningly left 1 minute for this.
Dick, our first question is, what percentage of your clients have gone down this path?
Excuse me, the path to the service provider model or the path to the infrastructure as a service?
Either.
Either. So I'd say that probably if we look at the mid to large scale process, not the SMB arena, that many organizations have started the ITIL movement, and probably about 20 to 30% have actually effectively implemented the service provider model. Taking it from there to implementing infrastructure as a service in a cloud environment, that is the automated provisioning at the front end and the back end billing, probably back end billing or people who actually understand the cost of their deployable resource is probably less than 5%. And at this stage, people are really only just considering automated provisioning there. From our point of view, I think we've seen maybe 5 or 6 people who are actively investigating that aspect. But to be fair, the software for that has really only been around for 6 to 9 months.
Thank you, Dick. Your next question is, What is more difficult in your opinion, server virtualization or front-end provisioning / deprovisioning?
Well, I think I'd have to say the provisioning is easier than the virtualization. And I say that because I've seen software that really does quite an incredible job of hitting all the hot buttons in automated provisioning. Whereas with virtualization, this is not a trivial task. Whether you use VMware with all of its components, which are incredibly rich, but also require high skill levels and high knowledge levels to effectively implement, or use Hyper-V or KVM in a more open environment, you still need some really skilled people to make sure that you virtualize to achieve the end result and don't just end up with a plethora of orphan machines out there consuming storage and resources that no one knows about.
Thank you, Dick. Does Glasshouse have a position on market leaders related to cloud automation?
I think the answer to that question is that Glasshouse is an independent and neutral service provider, and our preference is to help the client develop the requirements for a particular function and then assist the client look at what's out there at the time to make an appropriate selection. So we really don't recommend or comment on particular software products.